So, I think we're ready to begin. My name's Dan Smith. I'm director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Thank you so much for coming here this evening. We're also joined by an online audience, and we're going to have a conversation, as it's been billed, about the state of the world. And the participants in this conversation, to begin with, are some members of the board of the governing board of SIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And I say some members because, unfortunately, first of all, one person whose name was on the list when we advertised the meeting, Jessica Matthews, has been unable to make it, and also two other board members, Radha Kumar from India and Dewi Fortuna Anwar from Indonesia, have also been unable to make it. But we have, and I think you know this, and this is why you have come out on this nice cold evening in November, rather than getting back home immediately to coffee or tea or maybe something a little bit stronger and a little snack before dinner and cozy evening in front of the fire. You've come here instead because the board, my bosses, are such a tremendous group of people. And sitting as they are, Vladimir Baranovsky from Moscow from the IMMO Institute and actually a former staff member of SIPRI, very recently. Jan Eliasson, Ambassador Jan Eliasson, chair of the governing board, as you know, former foreign minister of Sweden, former deputy secretary general of the UN, former state secretary, cabinet secretary, coordinator of humanitarian affairs for the UN, mediator of the Iran-Iraq war conclusion agreement. Patricia Lewis from Chatham House in London, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, director of the program there on international security, arms control and disarmament. Lakhdar Brahimi, a monumental figure of UN diplomacy, Afghanistan special representative, Syria special envoy as well. Espen Barth Eide, former foreign minister and also former defense minister of Norway, and former special envoy, was it envoy, advisor, representative, one of those, on Cyprus. And sitting here, Jean-Marie Guénaud, who's previously the Undersecretary General, responsible for the Department of Peacekeeping operations, so in charge of an awful lot of soldiers doing good things, and also previously president of the International Crisis Group. So here we are, our topic, the state of the world. I'm not going to sit down, by the way, because that's the only way I can imagine I can keep this group under control. And I thought I would start with Jan. And Jan has divided the world into four groups. All of you belong to one of four groups, according to the chair. Optimists and pessimists. Right? We'll let them look after themselves. They're at the ends of the spectrum. In the middle, worried optimists and pessimists who haven't given up hope completely yet. And Jan, I have heard you in public and in private on several occasions declare yourself to be always an optimist, but today a worried optimist.
Right.
So let's start off with the worries and see if later on we can come to some of the optimism. What would you pick out as a couple of issues that would be the ones that worry you now?
Well, first of all, let me say how proud I am to be chair of this eminent board. And as you may have understood from Dan's comments, the three board members who are not here tonight are all women. Otherwise, you would have seen a better gender balance on the podium. I looked at some who I could read your minds. So here we are. Dan, I would say three things are worrying me. One is the character of conflict that I think is becoming more and more complicated, primarily because ethnic and religious factors more and more come into conflict, and also growingly the pattern that others interfere and cause what we call proxy wars. So the war in Syria is, of course, an example where you have countries in the region complicating things and extending the conflict. And now, recently also, there is another element on conflicts, namely the risk of nuclear confrontation, less so, hopefully, around the Korean Peninsula, but still around as an issue, especially if you see now so-called tactical nuclear weapons being developed. The second thing is, of course, climate disruption, climate change, climate disruption, which is a real worry and which we need to take very seriously, leading to change of behavior and patterns in all kinds of life, both internationally and at home. And the third reason for worry on my side, and I'm glad you mentioned we will come to the hope chapter later on.
It's not going to be all doom
Good,
and doom.
okay. The third one is something which is difficult to describe, but which the key words for me are polarization, fear, division, gaining points on us and them and so forth, both inside nations and between nations, and where in particular the refugee and migration issue has been used as a tool, political tool in a way that is pretty divisive in the world, but also made more complicated through the communications revolution with the social media, which easily goes into extremes one way or the other. So those are the three worries that I would like to point out,
right.
Masochistically.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's enough to be going on with. We can entertain ourselves with those fears to begin. So, Jean-Marie, is it right that conflicts are changing their character, or are we just becoming more aware of the eternal complexity of conflicts?
No, I think conflicts are changing, because after the end of the Cold War, we used to say, before the Cold War it was interstate conflict, after the Cold War is intrastate conflict. Now it's a mix, where there are very few conflicts that do not have a transnational element. They are not contained. And that makes them more difficult to solve, because you have to address the local level, the regional level, and the global level. And it's rare when the three circles are aligned. And Syria, sadly, is a good example of that. You have to get the Syrians together, but you would have to get the region together, and you would have to get the global powers together. And aligning those three circles is almost impossible. That's why you see all conflicts not ending and then new ones coming in.
So, Lakhdar, since Jean-Marie has mentioned Syria, tell us a little bit about what the experience is, what it feels like even, perhaps, but perhaps also in practice. What's involved in trying to get some kind of accommodation, some kind of spirit of accommodation going in the middle of this very, very complex, multidimensional, multi-layered conflict?
I think Jean-Marie has summed the situation in Syria beautifully well. It is at the same time a local conflict, a civil war, a regional proxy war, and an international area of conflict. And you have got to get all those three aligned, otherwise you are not going to go anywhere. But one of the big lessons that Syria teaches us is how terribly important, when the international, so-called international community or the important government want to get involved somewhere, how terribly important that they understand where they are going. And in the case of Syria, I think people, walked in with completely wrong assumptions and knowledge about what was going on. And therefore, their intervention made things worse. Now they are starting to realize, but after 7 years of doing the wrong things, it's difficult to start doing the right things.
Yeah. And I mean, presumably one example of doing the wrong things was trying to decide in advance who was a legitimate interlocutor in the talks.
Yeah, no. You see, it was decided that the regime was going to fall next week. Next week. It's bad enough that you make that mistake, but to keep repeating, but we told you next week. After 2 years, that's a very long week. Then they started saying, yeah, it's true. It's a bit more difficult. We will now try to work for a political solution. But nobody worked for a political solution. Everybody continued to try and work for a military solution. And now they are really trying to say, okay, what kind of political solution? But as I told you, after 7 years of doing the wrong thing, it's difficult.
Right. Well, jumping then from one topic to another that Jan raised, and you're going to have to get used to me just jumping from one track to another, because that's what I'm going to do through the next hour and a bit. Patricia, also Jan mentioned the nuclear dimension of this. The architecture of arms control appears to be crumbling, and that's not good. How real do you think the worries about the possibility of an open nuclear confrontation, nuclear war, really are? How concerned should we be?
So I think it's not as simple as just worrying about a nuclear war. I think what we need to be worrying about is a regional war becoming much bigger. And what we're seeing is the threshold for conflict lowering. We're seeing the rhetoric rising. We're seeing a lot of instability. We're seeing the rise of authoritarianism, the challenging of democracy, liberal democracy particularly. And we're seeing the use, and I'll get back to Syria, of chemical weapons, the weapons of mass destruction, by state and non-state actors. And we've seen it used as an assassination weapon in a couple of occasions recently. So what we're seeing, I think, is the lowering of threshold for use, the, if you like, preparedness for the use of these weapons. So if we start to see them as part of the normal, and we're seeing in Russia, we're seeing the United States break away from the shackles, from the checks and balances of arms control. We're seeing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty coming up to its 50th year now under severe threat again. And there's a lot of worry and dissatisfaction, I think, within that treaty, in that there's been almost no progress in multilateral nuclear disarmament since 1996.
So, part of what you're talking about is that what we often talk of as international stability and what we often talk of as human security, as if they were in two separate boxes, are actually profoundly intertwined. And the local, the regional, and the international or global levels that Lakhdar was talking about, because they're connected, there's a kind of transmission belt of risk from the local to the global level, given the wrong circumstances.
Absolutely, it's all about human violence. It's about our inability to deal with conflict. Conflict is normal, conflict is natural. Why do we always have to get violent about it? That's really where we're at. So that's true whether we're talking about warring factions in a country, in a region, or between two superpowers. It's about our inability to manage our differences in a non-violent way.
So Vladimir, if I can come to you with the question which I first asked Patricia. How do you see, how real are the worries that some people are expressing about nuclear war and about nuclear clashes?
Well, I see the main problem in the area of the arms control. It's the perspective of accelerating arms race and military preparations without any serious limitations, which is against the overall logic of the arms control. I see a lot of dangerous symptoms of this. Actually, some people believe, and I'm afraid that I tend to share this assessment, that arms control in general is a serious crisis, because we have already lost some of the major pillars of the arms control, beginning from what happened more than 15 years ago, the withdrawal of the United States from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and then the problems with the CFE treaty, Conventional Forces in Europe treaty, and then just what we are discussing right now, the perspective of disappearance of the INF treaty, treaty on medium and range missiles in Europe, which was at the beginning of the post-Cold War era, signed in 1987. So it's a very bad score. It's a very bad score, a very bad trend.
And moving along then the New START.
Well, a New START, you know, the existing agreement will be valid until the year 2021, but you know, it's not much time which is left for preparing a new one, and not a single exchange of opinions has already been made between Russia and the United States for preparing a new agreement. Moreover, there are a lot of doubts concerning this link between the INF Treaty and the future START agreement. And there are serious apprehensions that if we lose the INF Treaty, then we'll have very minimal chances for developing some kind of a substitute for the existing treaty on the strategic nuclear forces.
Patricia, you wanted to come
Yeah, I just wanted to... Are we allowed to just transition a little bit into the hope side? Because we do have a new treaty.
Yeah, all right.
Not too early.
Not too much.
Well, just to say, we do have a new treaty that was negotiated last year, the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons. And I'd like to get into a discussion of that later, as the only little bit of light we have on arms control.
No, I mean, that is one of the areas of potential hope that we can get into. I just wanted to get to the third of the, there was the conflicts at the local level, the nuclear, and then the climate change and security. And I wanted to get into that with you, Espen. What I didn't mention is that your position in Parliament now in Norway puts you in a place where you're thinking very much about that. So some thoughts about that, the climate change and security dimension.
Well, I think that, you know, I think it's fair to say that in addition to these sort of worries about nuclear war and so on, the number one challenge for the planet in the 21st century is whether we're able to cooperate in curbing climate change. We know that we can. We have much better knowledge than any time before about what causes it, and we have an increasing body of knowledge about what we can do about it, but it requires a very high level of international cooperation, not only to stop doing things, but also to do the new things. And of course, the tragedy is that that insight is happening in a world that's falling apart when it comes to multilateral institutions. So we need to work to preserve what we can of the multilateral system we used to have, but also to build coalitions of the people who actually want to move forward, and you know, a new type of multilateralism which is based on a can-do approach, and where those who want to move ahead can move ahead without waiting for the weakest link. And that's not easy in these times. It's not technology that will keep us away from it, it's the absence of politics. And I want to say also, we had with some of the researchers of SIPRI a very interesting mini-seminar earlier today about the connections between climate change and conflict. And there are many things, you know, warming, areas becoming inhabitable, water rising, people having to move, forced migration coming out of this that could lead to conflict. But it's extremely important not to be deterministic and say they will lead to conflict, because any problem can lead either to cooperation or conflict. And when they're not dealt with in a cooperative way, they can lead to conflict, but of course these can also be sources of getting together and finding solutions. Secondly, which people do not recognize sufficiently, is that climate mitigation, which we need, can also challenge international relations. For instance, when we stop using oil, which we will, the countries who built all their dependence on producing oil and the power relations that came out of oil relations between producer and consumer will change completely, and that will completely reshape the Middle East, for instance, and it will be a major challenge to Russia, a great benefit to China. And so there will be winners and losers of this transition as well, which can lead to significant political turbulence.
How about Norway?
Well, we simply have to realize in time that we shall use these good times we have now to move into what we're going to do afterwards. Yeah. We're working on that.
And Espen, I think you're taking us again with what you said on climate change, again into this question of the multi-layers, the kind of the local, the national, regional, and international. Because climate change is persistently a governance question. Right? It's not just, here is the impact of climate change, oh, disaster. It's, here is the impact of climate change, how are you responding to it in the village, in the county, in the country, regionally in the African Union, at the UN level, and so on. And that then goes, Jan, to the last point that you made, this question about polarization. We're looking for more cooperation at a time when international relations are breaking down, but I think you're also talking about sort of the quality of political discourse, that is becoming less less tending towards cooperative solutions, even in the local national, more tending towards taking positions and polarizing against each other, finding ways to exploit a problem for narrow political advantage. I mean, is this...
Yeah, well, no, my worry is what has already come up, this worry about multilateralism, that we paradoxically, in a time and age where we are so interdependent, have strong political tendencies to look inward and not cooperate and consider the outside world as a threat, which is enormously dangerous, whether it is merchandise, ideas, or people that come in. But I think also there is something in the quality of political discourse today which is disturbing, that you so easily land in extreme positions and then create a climate in which the normal dialogue, the civilized discussion and discourse doesn't take place. I don't know whether we are influenced by the new communication environment in which we live, but there is something that I find very uncomfortable in order to come back to sort of a discussion among parties inside a country and between countries where you honor dialogue. My job and the job of several of us here is the word, the dialogue, the communication. And there's so much of threat and demonstration of not talking to anybody, instead of realizing that anything requires a dialogue with anybody if you want to solve any problem. So I have a sort of uncomfortable feeling about this climate. Hard to define, but I just feel it.
Where is your optimism? Where is your optimism?
We'll sorry, I've got that on
in
the
my
clock.
4 categories, I told you, I'm the worried optimist, but I am also sometimes on my way to the pessimist who hasn't quite yet given up.
Yeah, we're going to work with you on this, Jan, and get you back into the
optimist side,
up to the healthy end of category 2. Vladimir, you see that? Well, let me start again. I think that plenty of people in Europe and looking at US politics see exactly what Jan is talking about with this sharpening polarization of discourse, a lot more hate speech in politics and so on. You see that also in Russia?
Well, I see it everywhere. Unfortunately, I think that it's a general trend. The problem is how significant is this trend, and whether we could say that it's a long-term trend which will continue forever. The worrisome problem is that we have now a kind of a postmodernist development in the international relations, where the issue of particular interests could become more prominent in many places. In the United States, so the slogan is "Let's make America great again." So, and this is the main issue. In my country, well, Crimea is a national interest for Russia, so let's take Crimea because it's possible, and it's it's important from the terms of view of the security interests of Russia. And it's just two opposite examples. But we could see this in many other places, not everywhere, hopefully, but in many places. I think there's a triumphalism of what I could define as sovereign particularism. Sovereign because each country, the argument is very simple. Each country has the right to think about its own interest, full stop. And then on the basis of this principle, it's possible to go very far away. But my hope is that this is a worrisome trend, but it is something which will not necessarily define the future development forever. Because we know in the history of international relations, we know ups and downs, we know different trends, and I think that now we are in this very unpleasant moment in history of international relations, but as a well-informed pessimist, I could say, when you worse times in the past, and we know that such kind of situation are not necessarily the end of history. In the history of the Cold War, we knew worse problems, we knew worse situation, and we know that it's possible to get out of this, and we could be hopeful about this re-establishment of the ascending trend, ascending trends toward more cooperative approach to international relations.
So in a few minutes, I want want to come to one of the issues you raised, Espen, which is the kind of the big transition if we do manage to green the world economy. But before that, I'd like to actually take a lap around you all. How you understand this issue, or this set of issues that Jan and Vladimir have just been articulating, and whether you find yourself, if you like, in the what was it, the hopeful pessimist or the worried I forget what the categories are now. But Jean-Marie, if I start with you and we just go along the panel in order.
Well, I'm more on the pessimist side who hasn't given up. I do think first you have to look at the different parts of the world. And if you're in Asia, for instance, you're not in that mood. You see that hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, and you think it's pretty good. There are issues, there are pollution, there are plenty of issues, but nevertheless, the world doesn't look so bad. I think in Europe, in the United States, there is a sense that the economic horizon has broadened, but that means the political space has shrunk.
Right.
And you're losing control of your future. And that creates a lot of anxiety. And the reaction is, well, the wall of Trump. The notion that you're going to try to... It's the politics of nostalgia in some way. You want the world to be as it was in the 50s, when Europe, when the United States were growing at a very high rate and were on top of the world. Now you know that ideologically the agenda is challenged because you feel that there are regimes that may not be democratic but that are doing pretty well. So you're not so sure that your own solutions are going to be accepted by the whole world, and you're not so sure that at home you're doing so well. So that anxiety, in a way, is a natural result of that new situation. And so long, and that's why, in my view, the greatest challenge is a domestic one. We are afraid of, is Russia going to be a threat? Is China going to be a threat? The most important thing is your own society will it be able to stick together, to have a sense of common purpose? And there's a kind of competitive decline there on who will stay the last in that world where there's a crisis of identity and purpose. That's my reading of the present situation.
Espen.
I very much agree with Jean-Marie on that, and it so happened that I was in London together, incidentally, with Rolf Ekéus and another illustrious group discussing the 100 years after the end of the First World War, and we ended up in a discussion on where are we now if we were in the 20th century. And there was the 1913 school and the 1938 school, which neither is very... both would be pessimist. But if you rather, as you will imagine, but if you rather think about the two post-war eras, the first one and the second one, of course, what we call the interwar years, they thought was the post-war years until they were proven wrong. The first one, we've been there before, because the first one was very much one about sovereign particularism. And that led to the Second World War. And then after the Second World War, the idea was that let's not do that again. Let's create institutions, common norms, and so on. And I think all that's now challenged. I'm not saying collapsing, but challenged. And I think here I come to Jean-Marie's point, because I think the individual state capacity to create this sense of common purpose and unity has been undermined by these rising inequalities, which are not only economic, but also access to information and all kinds of powers in all dimensions. And the sense that we are together gets lost, and then the people playing on this nostalgic feeling will come with Make America Great Again, take back control, or take Crimea back, whatever back, but it's always about something that used to be. This is a serious challenge, which I think has to be met by, first and foremost, not institutional reform at the UN, but by sort of sound national policies, because you can't have international cooperation if you don't get the state right, and to cultivate a sense of a purpose of the state and the state collaborating with other states, and that's what's now in play. Thankfully, I mean, in Europe, the populists are rising, but they're still not dominant. But it's a theme. What you're having here in Sweden now is the theme we all have. How do we deal with this this alternative rising trend?
Ragnar.
I don't know where Jan will put me. I don't know if there is a category of the scared people. Jean-Marie, in Asia, yes, half of the people have been lifted out of poverty. But there is now sectarianism of a kind that did not exist in India. There is also India and China are looking at one another, God knows how. Japan, what are they? They are thinking of nuclear, of going nuclear. And you see, China is a very interesting partner for a lot of people, but it's also an uncomfortably too strong a neighbor in Asia. So these are sources of serious worry in Asia. Elsewhere, I think, as has been said, the global village, paradoxically, has produced a lot of very, very small villages. So we all now accept that we are living in a global village, but we behave as if all that exists is the smallest possible village. So that is, and then you spoke about 1913. I read recently that in January 1914, the people who read in tea leaves and the serious analysts, nobody thought that there would be a war in September. So you see, we have all these problems, great possibilities. I mean, the world can be a wonderful place, but we don't seem to be doing much to make the world that beautiful place.
Patricia, I think after that, despite the fact that we're early in terms of the hope clock, you've got to say something nice now.
Right, okay. I was going to describe myself as a worried realist.
Okay.
But where I'm realistic is this, that I do have great faith in humanity. I think human beings have enormous capacity to do good and bad, evil and good, and that the universe we inhabit, so I'm a physicist originally, so indulge me for a moment. The universe we inhabit, it tends to disorder. If you don't put the energy in and create order, it will just go to disorder. That's called entropy. And so it takes very little energy to do harm. It takes enormous amount of energy to order and do good. And if we can just understand that and recognize it, and we are really gardeners, right? We have to look after our garden. We have to tend to the weeds. We have to dig up the roots. We have to make sure the gravel path doesn't get completely ruined when people walk on it. We just have to keep on doing it, whether it's winter, whether it's summer, whether it's autumn or spring. And we tend to get during the good months, human beings tend to get very lazy, don't we? We tend to do nothing. So I see when we've had periods of good times, we've been a bit too lazy. And what we need to do is get busy again. And I have enormous faith in this next generation coming up, the people between their 20s and mid-30s. I think they're extraordinary. And I witnessed this as to what's just happened now in the American midterms. Look at the young people coming forward, putting themselves forward. I listen to the debates in the UK at the moment about Brexit. I listen to the young people about their future. And they have a vision about how this world could be. And I think it's our job to help them realize that vision. That's what I think we should stop talking about what mess we've made of the world. And I think we collectively should be helping young people realize a completely new vision for what this world could be, which is about, it is about human rights. It is about reducing the impact of climate change and preparing for it. But it's also about, we're on the cusp of enormous new breakthroughs and technologies. There are risks, big risks associated, but there's huge promise as well. And I think it's about understanding the promise and reducing the risks. And if we can help the next generation do that, then we can just get through this period and into a much better period where we just need to keep very busy keeping it good.
Good. Thank you. Jan, do you want to...
No, I already made my case.
Vladimir? Okay. So I want to come to the issue that Espen raised, which is would be one of the things that would say, okay, not to challenge your idea of what's realistic, but how could that realism work in practice? Because it's clear that, I mean, the scientific consensus is, the IPCC recent conclusions are about climate change. They're very clear. We have to change course, and we have to do that quicker than we are changing course at the moment. I think from memory, if the world's output, if you generalize from China's output of carbon to say, what would that mean for the world if all countries in the world were doing that? You'd have 5 degrees of global warming within about half a century. I think the USA's is around 4, and Europe's was around 3 or 3.5 degrees. So, in other words, everybody is still producing too much carbon, and something's got to be done, and fast, to decarbonize economies. And as Espen said, that's going to have big economic effects. You can't make a big transition like that, just like you couldn't have the Industrial Revolution without having enormous political consequences to that. You can't make a transition like decarbonization without having those big kind of influences. So Espen, since you kicked this off, why don't I start with you and then pick up the thoughts of the panel on that? And then I want to open up and see what kind of questions we can pick out from the audience before we move into the hope section.
Exactly. And I'm on the worried optimist side, and I've done the worry part, so now comes the optimist part here. The upside of this is that, imagine, it's always been said kind of in science fiction type of style that if the planet was about to be attacked by an alien species from a different galaxy, we would probably collaborate to stop them. So finally there would be cooperation. And in a sense, the climate challenge is that kind of challenge. And two things make me more optimistic. One is that it's so bad that people are starting to understand how bad it is, also outside the very narrow clubs that they did. This is now becoming a political theme which carries weight. I think in many countries, parties, if they don't deal with this, they will simply be out of the game. You have to relate to this, particularly if you want the young people to be engaged in it. And secondly, technology is moving very fast as well. So in large part of the world, it's already much less expensive to use solar or wind power than coal or oil. So you just have to roll out this much faster and start adapting to these new realities. I would actually say if we had 200 years rather than 20, 30 years, the market would probably fix this. But we don't have these years, so you need the market plus very sound, clear policies which points the direction. And I think you don't really need to wait for every single country to do that. It will be the early adapters will be winners. And I think to create that sense that it's actually rather dumb to wait. It's much smarter to capture this and make it to part of your national strategy and your regional strategy. There's a lot of things that you can get done in that way. So in that sense, I think there is a certain reason for optimism, that precisely this recognition. And it's not only energy, it's also circular economy, using resources much smarter. Just one little picture is the Industrial Revolution has made us, on average, 200 times more work productive.
Yeah.
It means you use 200 times less to produce the same outcome of food, for instance. Lately, we've become a little bit more energy efficient, means that a modern car, modern airplane uses less energy to fly a kilometer, drive a kilometer. What we're not being good at is resource productivity, but there is a vast possibility of becoming much smarter at using and reusing. And I think people are beginning to see that you don't need to have boring bad lives where you have to shower in cold water and not eat much and live in cold buildings in order to these things can all be achieved. You just have to get there. So I think that there is a growing recognition of this, and I see it in investors, for instance, who are now de-investing from some of the more carbon intense industries and moving to much more environmental friendly, not because they're climate activists, but because they see where this is heading.
Let's go downbeat again, so I turn to Jean-Marie.
Well, I think that the last point of Espen is important. That is the economic forces in the market, that a number of actors do believe that through their own action, they can, what they finance, what they don't finance, where they put their money, they can have an impact. Where I am more worried than Espen is I think that while there is a growing agreement on the need to limit climate change, there is no real agreement on the ways to do it. For instance, nuclear energy. You have experts who believe that without nuclear energy, the renewable won't do the trick, at least not in the time frame required. Others believe, yes, they can. Myself, I have no opinion. I'm not an expert on that. But I think there is a wide range of opinions there. And so how you address it, how you really build an international consensus in the time frame that is needed, I'm not clear. And the other thing is that I do think that there are other issues that may not be as prominent as climate change. I mean, you mentioned water as a source of cooperation, of conflict earlier. Water is a very big issue in Africa. We see already with the Nile all the questions that arise around the Nile River. But in Asia, it's a huge issue. And how you allocate resources among these competing and necessary efforts that need to be made, that requires a lot of international cooperation at a time when we see a decline in international cooperation. No country can fix it alone, and that's where I remain worried.
Let's assume for a moment, I want to come to you, let's assume for a moment that indeed the transition does start to happen in an identifiable, visible way. We see the rich economies beginning progressively to decarbonize themselves. And that, obviously, as Espen raised, has big implications for, amongst other places, the Middle East. Do you see a sort of a readiness or a capacity in the Middle East to be handling that kind of circumstance? Do you really plummet down to through the bottom floor of pessimism with that? Do you think there's a capacity, or well?
There is more than discussion. There is some effort to start doing things using the sun and other sources of energy. They are talking about the end of oil and so on, but I don't think they believe it's going to happen very soon. They don't believe that. But again, I am very, very worried. We started in Algeria in 1962, 63. We were very much aware, much more aware of the danger of desertification than we are now. We started building, what we call a wall against the desert, planting trees. We've stopped doing that. And then, you see, South Koreans, Japanese, Malaysians are destroying the forests in Africa and also in Borneo. And also they're cutting trees all over the place. So the little that is being done is very little compared to the harm that we are going, that we are continuing to do.
So, I mean, Patricia, you were talking about, the harm is still being done. But surely at some point, the geopolitical point has got to sink in. This transition is coming, and the ones who get in there first are going to have an advantage.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. However, I think one of the things that we're missing here in this discussion is the timescale.
Right.
So, global warming, climate change is already underway, and some of it's going faster than we had predicted.
Yes.
And the predictions are complex. It's a very complex system, but basically more water in the atmosphere. More water in the atmosphere means more turbulence. So what we're seeing is increased turbulence, and we'll start to see then all sorts of knock-on effects. So even if we go down the nuclear route, the amount of time it takes to build nuclear, it won't be enough. Even if we go down massive investment in renewable energies, etc., again, will we be able to do it in time? Even if we get fantastic savings in terms of energy efficiency due to smart technologies, even so, we will have to prepare for change, and we are having to deal with change quite rapidly. So we need all of those things, and I think we're going to get there. But we also need preparedness for massive change in rising sea levels, in desertification, in flooding, in food crop failures, and so on. We know all this is coming. Even if it's not as bad as the worst predictions, preparing for it will make us more efficient. It's a win-win for us. So let's start doing it now. Let's stop being, if you like, blinkered about what's happening. And if we can do it in a way that we unite across the divides, then that could help solve our... I'm being very optimistic now. I'm not normally so optimistic. But I am worried, and I'm basically calling out to people to put this as if it were the alien coming from outer space to unite, because it is our only planet that we're on at the moment.
And Jan, one of the things that you were highly involved in your years as Deputy SG at the UN was developing the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which both have climate and water, along with poverty, inequality, zero hunger, and so on, and also Goal 16 on peace and strong institutions. But also, I think that one of the strengths of the SDGs is the way that they are seen to interact with each other. It's an interconnected whole. So can you connect that to...
Well, thank you very much, because I think there is a fear, there is a worry, legitimate, that problems are so difficult, so huge to deal with, that you land in some type of hopelessness. And therefore you need to show that there are tools to be used. And I'm very happy that we have this machinery, this roadmap to a sustainable future, or toolbox to repair the world, or survival kit for humanity, as it can be called. These 17 goals, actually, I had a competition this morning whether I put on the SIPRI pin or the 17 goals that I also have. I think this is really something that if we are to sort of find an action plan to reach what we wanted in the Paris Agreement, this is it. It covers all the areas internationally, because also what we have to do at home. With this negotiation, I have stopped using the word developed, or the pair of words, developed and developing countries. We are all developing countries. And there is a stronger burden on the rich countries to deliver to reach sustainability and fight climate change. And these goals is actually this roadmap and very practical toolbox, and lifts people out of this sense of hopelessness. This goes beyond the climate issue that we discuss here. It has to do with, we have a recipe to deal with issues internationally together. And since you also correctly pointed the fact that the huge difference between the MDGs, I was around for that time also, and the SDGs is that the SDGs are also related to peace and security, peaceful society, and human rights. Human rights in its wider sense, economic, social, cultural, political, civil. And by that you connect to this beautiful formula that I'm happy to have been contributed when I was President of the Assembly, namely, there is no peace without development, and there is no development without peace, and none of the above without respect of human rights and functioning institutions and rule of law. So I already am entering the hope factor, because I think this shows the power of international cooperation that can be translated to the regional, national and local level in the end. So we have to try to be concrete about the hope factors. And here is one reason to go for it.
And Vladimir, do you see a possibility that this kind of thinking starts to inform international relations in the next 1, 2, 3 decades?
As an optimist, the answer is yes. But I just want to ask Jan, why, when speaking about human rights, you address this to me?
No, when I talk about economic and social and cultural rights.
Well, in economic and social and cultural rights,
and civil and political.
With all my heart, I'm in favor of this, as well as in political. No. Well,
you are ahead of your time. Great.
Well, but this is a problem. We are a little bit ahead of our time with all these discussions about sustainable development goal. I'm fully in favor of this. But we have just to take into account that human beings are a little bit lazy, they're conservative, they're egoistic, they will tend to focus upon problems which touch upon their immediate concerns, like, for instance, climate change, the big issue, but it has to be dealt on the level of the whole globe. Water problems, these are regional issues, and that's why I think it's more realistic to deal with these problems on a regional basis, because in some countries there are no such problems, but in some areas it's very acute. I know that from the former Soviet Union, from the Soviet territory, in Central Asia, we have these problems of the water resources, and this is because the problem is very serious. There, it's a very strong incentive for those countries who have some very specific problems in relations between them. It's a strong incentive for them to address this issue, and sometimes they are able to address this in spite of all the conflict and other conflictual elements. So I'm very hopeful in broader sense, but I think that in practical terms we have to focus upon not so much about, you said, capacity, is there to address this issue. I should say we should more focus about the necessity to address this issue. When and
that necessity maybe is more visible when you bring it down to the concrete and the specific.
Right.
I'm going to take a comment from Espen and then invite questions from the floor. There's a couple of roving mics, so be ready to put your hands up. But
I agree to a large extent. I think that in many cases, and sometimes that coincides luckily with sort of the global issues. I mean, for instance, the Indians and Chinese have become very much aware of polluted cities because people complain about not seeing the sky. And some of the measures they eventually will take, which is, to change the energy and also transportation methods, will actually also have a positive climate effect. So even if that was not the main reason, but the more local reason. But there's on energy, there's one thing which trying to bring in the optimist, not because I disagree with, but is that some of the countries that emerge quickest, they do not have fossil fuel. If they could have more viable, cheaper alternative to fossil fuel, why would they remain dependent on difficult countries? And why will they pay all this foreign currency if they don't have to? If you can capture your sun or your wind or whatever else they have, why won't you do that for a pure, not because you want to save the climate, because it's rational. So I think eventually you will see that some of the countries that now are driving the world economy will do that for completely different purposes than climate change, but it will be positive for climate change.
It will have the same effect. Questions from you all? Any hands? No hands? Not the first. There's one there.
Thank you, and thank you for a very interesting discussion. I wanted to pick up on your thoughts on the evolving, the new trends in conflicts and the new type of conflicts. But what about the tools that we have to solve these conflicts, about mediation, peace resolution? Do we also need to update those in some way? Thank you.
Well, we've got some experience of mediation on the panel. Lakhdar, I'll begin with you, and then Jan and Espen.
I think there is no doubt that mediation has evolved. We have learned quite a few things. We are doing things perhaps a little bit better than we used to, starting with the United Nations. How to do it and where to do it. See, there was, I think, Kofi started with the Brahimi report, and then you have the HIPPO report.
Who was the author of the Brahimi report?
I don't know.
He was a very good one.
He's brilliant.
You see, it's not enough. You see, I don't think we understand, you see, this description of evolving of conflict. This is not enough. It doesn't say enough that we don't understand conflict enough, well enough to deal with it properly.
Jan?
Well, I think this is related to the urgent need to understand the importance of acting early, of doing real prevention. The word prevention is used so much that it has lost almost meaning. I prefer now to speak about listening to the vibrations. I have spent a lot of my life with humanitarian crisis, with conflicts and war, and seen the effect of it, like practically all of us here. And I am almost, I think we need to really show respect for these vibrations. Obvious that things will go wrong. Iran and above all to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates a couple of months before the Yemen war, and warned about the consequences of that war. Some people told me, I won't quote them, that it would be over in 3 months. And here we are, look at Yemen today. And you see human rights violations at an early stage in a country, well, that turns out later to become a civil strife, civil war, and then you have the proxy wars coming in, the regional and international dimensions. So I would say the question of mediation, I'm glad you brought back the issue to that realm, is really to show respect for early action. Early warnings we have a lot of, but early action, and do something about it. And then also show respect for what we have achieved. I'm very critical, of course, of the United States leaving the JCPOA. I was in on that. It was
the Iran nuclear deal.
The Iran nuclear deal. It was an enormous diplomatic achievement. Enormous diplomatic achievement. And then suddenly, United States throws it out. Ban Ki-moon should be given a lot of credit for his work on climate. He worked enormously, intensely on that issue. And then suddenly, you leave this agreement. I was in planning for the migration and refugee meeting in 2016. We had 2 compacts we negotiated, refugees and migrants. And now, country after country are leaving the migration compact, in spite of the fact that they had signed on in July. No respect for the enormous work on negotiation and the side of negotiation diplomacy. So I really think that it's time for us to have a revival of diplomacy and understanding the enormous value of having those structures there to maintain peace and maintain the road to development and human rights.
Espen, any thoughts? And then if I may, Jean-Marie.
First, I agree with both Lakhdar and Jan. I believe that we've got somewhat better with the tools of mediation. We're far from perfect, but I think people here have contributed to it. We've got a little bit better understanding what it is and how complex it is and so on. That's on the good side. But in the meantime, the bigger picture of a world becoming more disjointed had made it more difficult. Just your point, which you made here and before, is that you need to deal with the Russians and Americans, with the Iranians, the Saudi Arabians, and the Turks, and all the local 800 local groups and whatever. Makes that even if you're good at these tools, and with these people disagree, then what? And I've been involved directly with Cyprus as a UN envoy, but then as a foreign minister with Colombia and Philippines and Middle East and so on. And my sense is that the reason it's becoming more difficult is that the great powers actually don't want the mediator to succeed. Yeah. So if you go back to the 90s, you will typically find a Security Council, let's say West Africa. So some country, maybe the UK, so can we sort out Sierra Leone, please? And you'll say, be my guest, we don't care. But feel free, here's your mandate, go on, see what you can do. Absolutely. Or we'll go to Liberia, America, please do if you can. So there was this tolerance. It was not, a real buy-in, but fine. Now you will normally find a Security Council or regional great players say, no way this is going to work because it's not my piece. It's not my piece, I want another piece.
Look at Libya.
And all these people will say, I would like peace too, but not on those terms. I want my kind of peace.
So, Jean-Marie, it's a kind of almost like a sense of the center cannot hold, so therefore the periphery falls apart. Is that the picture we're seeing?
Well, I think it's true that the discord at the center makes any resolution on the periphery more difficult. We are supposed to be in the optimistic part, but I will add one pessimistic element, is that I think...
That's the last one.
Just, if you allow me.
But we're counting.
Full war is bad for business, but full peace is bad for some business. And you have more and more conflicts where the traditional idea of mediation is that you have parties, you need to negotiate some kind of power sharing, some kind of arrangement where everybody will get something, because on the assumption that in the end they would rather have peace. But you have situations where a number of actors are quite happy not with full war, but with a sort of grey area of low intensity conflict, or sometimes not so low intensity, where they have adapted to it. They live off conflict, and then mediation becomes extremely difficult because you have interests at stake which want to keep the conflict alive. And then that's when usually the member states of the United Nations say, okay, let's throw peacekeepers at it, which is the worst possible response, because the peacekeepers are not going to enforce any peace. They don't have that capacity.
There has to be a peace for them to keep.
And you see a number of situations now where the hardware of peacekeeping is preferred to the software of mediation, because nobody knows how to manage the software now. And that's a dangerous evolution that can only discredit peacekeeping. That also raises new challenges for peacekeeping. You said no peacekeeping where there's no peace to keep. The problem is when you look at most peace operations of the UN today, except for a few exceptions, like Cyprus, they are deployed in places where it's not full war, but it's far from full peace. And so, do you pull out? No. Because it would be worse. Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, there's been 18 years of a peacekeeping operation.
60 years. 60 years.
Yes, almost, yeah.
With 61.
With a few intervals.
Since 1963.
Yeah, right.
And a big mission for the last, it was reinforced, yes, for the last 15 years, a very big mission.
Yeah.
And so you pull the plug now, there is a risk of increased violence.
It could be worse.
It could be worse.
Yeah.
You keep the peacekeeping mission, the government thinks, okay, it's out, the UN will do it, we don't have to fix our own problems. And so it's a real trap that has been opened, and nobody knows how to close it.
And I think it is a problem. I mean, one gets raised with the idea, especially raised in sort of peace research and peace mediation work, that peace is in everybody's interest. So all you have to do is sort of find that basis. And that view lasts until you meet somebody and you can see quite clearly it's low intensity conflict. It's a low level of violence which is in their interest, and that's what their business model is based on. Patricia?
Yeah, so I'm with Jan. I think that there are things we know how to do, and we've had fantastic successes as well. I'm thinking of Northern Ireland, thinking of South Africa. You know, we can all name those. We forget how we have worked. Yeah. But perhaps what we need to think of it more as a medical issue. You can interpret violence as a medical problem. And there are some conflicts which would be like HIV or diabetes. They will just need constant treatment. And as long as it doesn't break out and destroy the host, then that's what they need. There are others which you will be able to do nothing about. It will overwhelm and destroy. And then there are other diseases that you can treat, and you can treat them quite well. And if I think about the medical profession, just imagine if they're taking the same attitude as we take in our field, which is, it's impossible. No, what they did was they went ahead and they collected data, they tested things out, they looked at preventive, they looked at cures, they looked at all sorts of lifestyle changes, they've looked at let's take responsibility, let's find out how to treat everything and how to prevent things. And I think we need to do the same thing with conflict. I think we need to treat it as a disease and find out what the causes of the disease are, try to treat those if we can. If it's too late, try to maintain it, and do no harm.
I think Patricia is absolutely right, and I don't think that any of us is saying, let's give up. No, we don't give up. But we have got to say it as it is. And in Libya, the problem has been created by international intervention. And it has been sustained by international intervention. And it is prevented from being solved by foreign intervention. We've got to say it as it is. But we don't give up. And we don't leave the Congo. We don't leave Libya. We don't leave Syria. And the Secretary General has just appointed a new envoy to Syria who is going to have a hell of a time. That we keep at it. That's not in question.
If Gairo Pedersen is watching, then we give him all our best wishes and a sense of solidarity for walking into that job. Another question, in fact, from the Ambassador of Norway.
Thanks very much indeed, Dan, and for giving me the floor as well. And thanks for your informed viewpoints and your leading the pack as well. I take issue with you on one point, and that is your optimism when it comes to reduce the demand for oil. I might be misinformed, of course, but wasn't it in 2017? At no time in human history has so much oil and petroleum products been produced as of 2017. And it might be some transformation taking place in the transport sector, but the aircraft industry will probably grow enormously, particularly in Asia of the next couple of decades. Then you have people tell me who know more about this than I do, the petrochemical industry, where there are basically no substitutes to oil. Are you being too optimistic? Or is it rather the case that oil is here to stay and invest in big oil?
Espen, what's your view on that?
No, I think that, I mean, it's true that the demand has grown for now, but I also think that the projection of this continuous demand is wrong. I think IEA gets it wrong every single year, which does not prevent them from getting it wrong the next year again, because they do predictions based on historical data, which is fine if things don't change in manifest ways. But I think we are on the cusp of several disruptions which will make both the production and the consumption of energy simply much more economically viable. And it will take some time, and it will be a competition. It will have different speeds in different countries. But I think that the combination of availability of cheap alternative energy, the insights into the climate effects will drive policies, and all this will variate together in such a way that I think that change will come faster rather than sooner. And there's also some, for the nerds, there's also some technical problems in the predictions, because if you actually use electrical energy, you use much more energy much more efficiently than, I mean, for instance, an electrical car uses 100% of the energy in the battery almost. And a petrol car uses 15 to 18% of the energy for driving the car. Rest is heat. So new energy types is actually much more attractive once you get there. The question is, and it's still a question, I agree with you, is whether we get the world to make these early major investments that will get you there. I think the jury is out, but I think that we will have to do it. And for an oil-producing country like ours, I think it's better to see the writing on the wall and understand that we don't have to stop producing, but we have to prepare for a time where we might not have the demand we're used to. And if we can accelerate the alternative demand back home, we might give a little help to our friends on this fight. So,
Yes.
Göran Lennmark,
Yeah, okay.
former chair.
Yes.
We have 4 chairs of SIPRI here.
Göran.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Coming back a bit to the optimistic side, though, I think that there are recent events that perhaps go in the other direction. We have seen what happened in South Africa when the corrupt regime has fallen, and you probably have a new anti-corruption. Ethiopia, see what happened in Malaysia. Just to mention a few, I think that democracy and open is fighting back. One reason is that it's so hard to see an alternative. There is no common alternative to the development that has been there now for a long time. There is no ideological, there are scattered individual, but no real alternative to producing the all good things that essentially we've done for a number of decades. So I think there are also room for optimism.
I mean, thanks. I think that, Göran, with that, you put your finger on what was a sort of a long-term historic optimism, which you could see in various works that were being written in 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11. Basically seeing, with the increasing number of liberal democratic states and the increasing proportion of the world population living under liberal democracy, with the apparently increasing economic success of that combined political economic model of the free market and liberal democracy. You could feel that history is going in, right? And that's the good and the right direction to be going. And you had all kinds of indicators like the number of armed conflicts are coming down and the average lethality in each armed conflict is less than what it was. And, you know, maybe a book like Steven Pinker's, The Better Angels of Our Nature, exaggerated that, but there was also something real at that point that was being seen. Now I think in the almost a decade, when was Lehman Brothers? Was that September 2008?
2008.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we just passed the 10-year mark of the financial crisis. That became, you know, a crisis of the system, became an economic crisis, and with enormous political knock-on effects. And I think that's kind of the issue about maintaining the optimism that gives you the sense of dynamism and commitment to try to change things against the rising tide of pessimism, if you like. So I'll ask for some comments on that. Patricia first.
Well, the UK has had 10 years of austerity.
Yeah.
So if you want to understand Brexit, you could start there. So I'm also Irish, as you know, I'm a dual national, and I go over to Ireland, which was hit even harder in many respects, but Ireland is out of austerity and has been for a while. So I think there's some really important questions to ask there. But if I look back 10 years, and I look at the turbulence that we're facing now, a large part of it, I think, could be laid at the door of the financial crash. It didn't affect everyone in the same way. Different countries have been affected differently, but the whole world system has had a huge impact. And you said politically, I would say more on the lives of poor people, where it's had the biggest impact.
Well, and one of the results is, of course, Brexit.
Yeah.
And by that, the weakening of Europe. And then you look at the war in Syria and the droughts and the climate disruption in Africa, Chad Lake and so forth, and you see the flow of migrants and refugees, and then you see the political map changing in Europe. And European Union not being able to come together on a unified position, at least sharing responsibility. And you even see in this wake of the fear factor, some sliding out of the democratic institutions, as we see in certain parts of Central Europe. So it's all connected. But I think we should, and by that, by the way, now with the signs coming from the United States, there is really a test of democracy. And I wouldn't say crisis, but we need to really mobilize all good forces now to show that we are standing by the structure that we built up at the end of the Cold War against this horror that existed between 1930 and 1945. It's probably the bloodiest parts of human history. So we need to mobilize these good forces now. And there, I think you can take encouragement from not only the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 48, the UN Charter 45, the establishment of the European Union, and everything that was done as a human protest against this horror, but also certain diplomatic processes. I think diplomacy, we need to revive diplomacy. There is a diplomacy deficit in the world. For instance, Rolf, you and I, and also I think both Göran and Daniel and Sven-Olof have worked with this. The process of confidence building measures in Europe Act. What did we do? We decided, I was a young diplomat, only helping someone who was a big boss of mine, but we established 3 baskets. One for security dialogue, one for economic exchange, and one for human contacts, cultural contacts. I'm sure our friends from Korea, North and South, would see the value of confidence building measures, of moving on these 3 tracks: security dialogue, economic exchange, and people-to-people exchange. In any place we are in crisis today, you have these enormously important processes. I claim that when the wall tumbled down in 1989, the process started in 1975 because of these, the work of that, what we did in confidence building at OSCE and also information with others, breaking down the walls, you know. So that's the point, you know. pick up the good things that we have done and use it and revive it and stand up for it so that we can have a good case for the liberal world order that was established.
Vladimir.
I agree with you completely, but let me remind you about one counter-argument which could be used by your opponents. You said that when the wall crashed, it all started in 1975. These opponents would say, that's why we shouldn't have started in 1975 in order to maintain the wall.
I will
And
accept
this is an
that.
argument.
I can live with that.
Argument.
A question at the back? Rasul?
It was a very fruitful discussion, but I would like to argue with some panelists that they were trying to be very optimistic. And I would like to recall the JCPOA as a legacy of the diplomacy. As Jan told, it was tremendous diplomacy was done during many years, and it would be as a heritage of diplomacy. But unfortunately, nowadays you are witnessing that if you would like to talk about peace and war, we should not ignore about the impact of one permanent member of Security Council, which is trying to jeopardize this legacy. And it was not as a bilateral or not multilateral, but one of the resolutions of United Nations Security Council. But one of the members of Security Council is trying to punish rest of the world if they are going to implement this resolution. And at the end of the day, I'm very much worried about the decision when the pressure is mounting inside Iran, because all of the sanctions are back to Iran. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, it's not foreseeable that what would happen about this legacy of diplomacy.
So, I mean, that's the question from the ambassador of Iran. So, what do you think is the knock-on effect of the abandonment by the US of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Programme of Actions? Patricia?
I think it's a problem for Iran, obviously. It's a problem for Europe, and Europe with Russia and China, trying to keep the faith with that agreement. It wasn't a perfect agreement. You were referring to the United States and the Security Council. I would hesitate to just hold them responsible for everything, because I would say there isn't a perfect country among us. Over a period of time, probably everyone, at least in the permanent members, has done something wrong in that way. But pulling out of the JCPOA, out of the Iran deal, is, in my view, a mistake. Having said that, though, I think it will have a lot of knock-on effects, one of which is any other negotiation that the United States enters into. How will we provide the checks and balances to make sure that they cannot leave? Withdrawing from the INF Treaty was mentioned, withdrawing from the ABM Treaty back in 2002 as well. We can point to removing itself from the Biological Weapons Convention, not ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. I think there's a lot of this sort of pattern of behaviour which we do need to address in terms of being a permanent member of the Security Council. And I think being a permanent member of the Security Council comes with responsibility. Responsibility to find agreement is primary. The responsibility to provide international peace and security is absolutely at the core of that position on the Security Council. So how to move forward? To a degree, we have to make some kind of decision. Either we wait out the current situation and hope that it's over in a few short years and manage it, or we have to find a different route, maybe go back to the negotiating table, because it may not be sustainable even for a few years for Iran. So I think we do need to think this through quite quickly and make a decision.
Marta?
I think that we are all to blame in this. This is a treaty that has been negotiated for years by the 6 probably most powerful countries in the world with Iran. They have reached an agreement, they signed it, they took it to the Security Council, and they voted for it unanimously. And the most powerful country in the world withdraws from there just like that. The sanctity of treaties, were something that we were told, new countries and so on, be careful, you have got to respect your signature. If you don't, if the United States doesn't respect its signature, and we say nothing, this is, I think, not very good for the rest of the world, irrelevant of the treaty itself. I think, I don't know what could have been done, but to take it lying down and say, it's a pity that the President of the United States is not serious, that he is not responsible, that's not enough.
Right.
That's not enough at all.
There were three pieces of good news 2015 at the UN. It was the SDGs, it was the Paris Agreement, and it was the JCPOA that the Security Council put on. And it's a non-proliferation issue. There is lots at stake, and that's it. It's a question of what happens inside Iran as a consequence. You know more about that than we do, Mr. Ambassador. And then thirdly, it has caused a rift between US and Europe. It's European companies that are being hit. Not one American company is hit. And there is an attempt from Europe's side to try to find a compensatory mechanism, but it's very hard. So the private sector is leaving in great numbers.
So I think we're into the last few minutes, and I think there's one last question here.
Thank you very much. I'm Maaz Mahmoudi. I'm the ambassador of Tunisia. Thank you very much. I mean, it's been such a pleasure to hear all these knowledgeable views from such an impressive panel. My question is about an issue which has not been that much touched upon, which is the illegal migration, which is very important in the Mediterranean region. And, well, what is your take, gentlemen, about the insistence of the EU on having those, call them illegal migrants, hotspots or detention centers or whatever, in one of the North African countries, and the outright rejection of those countries, at least for Tunisia, to host those platforms? Thank you, and I'd be much interested to hear His Excellency Minister Brahimi on that. Definitely.
I think we'll go along the panel, give everybody a stab at that. Jean-Marie.
Well, I think
just to remember, we're into the last 5 minutes or so.
I think governments in Europe have a hard time being candid with their people. Migrations are here to stay. And pretending otherwise is just not a credible message. I think governments in Europe should prepare opinion to the notion that there will be a managed flow of migrations, that it cannot and should not be stopped. At the same time, I think it's important to make a distinction between refugees and migrants. And that the general hypocrisy of mixing the two to, in a way, kill the two flows, that doesn't help migrants, and it destroys the law, the convention for refugees. So I think there should be an honest discussion with countries in Africa on what are the manageable flows of migrants. I think the notion that you just throw development aid, to be honest, at countries is dishonest too, because the reality, all studies show that to migrate, even in the desperate way in which migrants go, it's an investment. So it's not the poorest who migrate. When there is some development, actually it increases.
It's almost a characteristic of development that you get some out migration.
Yes, and so the notion that you just get rid of the problem by throwing money at development is wrong. Doesn't mean that one shouldn't do development, obviously, but it means that linking the two is not honest. And so my sense is that what is needed is really more frankness on the situation if one wants to address it.
Espen?
I think Jean-Marie's key word here is managed. I think European population can tolerate if migration, if the perception is there's some kind of control on it. If it's managed, you don't necessarily need to have this populist rise. But if the perception is, and the reality doesn't matter, if the perception is that it's unmanaged, it's chaotic, it doesn't follow any kind of rules, and we're overwhelmed, it will lead to populists taking over every single country, and then there's no refugees coming in anywhere. So you need, and I think governments in many places, I think including here and in my country, are beginning to understand that this is a fine nuance between being liberal and tolerant and creating a sense that we have some kind of control over this. That's, I think, is very crucial. And also, if you want to defend the Refugee Convention, I think we also have to be quite narrow in interpretation of what that covers, and then have other policies for other people.
Tunisia is quite right not to solve the problems for Europe. They cannot, even if they wanted to. But you see, let's talk a little bit about ourselves. Europe has problems, they deal with it the way they can. But I'm sorry to see that Africans are not talking to one another about this problem. I think we should really now, people north and south of the Sahara, get together and talk about this problem. What are we going to do with it? The second thing that, again, I think we are not talking about it enough in North Africa. When people are sold in the market in Tripoli, that's a problem for all of us. And we aren't talking about it enough. So these are, yes, you are not going to solve the problem, even if you wanted to. You cannot solve the problem for Europe. It's a pity that we in Africa are not talking about this problem amongst ourselves to see how perhaps we can, if not solve it, at least control it a little bit. And some byproducts of this situation that are totally intolerable, and we publish an article about it and say, oh, terribly sorry, unacceptable. We are selling people in our countries. These are the three comments I would make.
Patricia?
So I think we need to be really clear that when it comes to refugees, people fleeing from oppression, from conflict, that international law applies, and we need to make sure that these people are taken care of and given asylum. That's absolutely vital. Managed migration, managed economic migration, is something that benefits all of us. I wouldn't be sitting here if my family, the Welsh family and the Irish family, hadn't been economic migrants, escaping from abject poverty to the United States, to Canada, to the UK, in the case of the Irish, and making, having been educated, because education is everything for poor people. So you can lift yourself out of poverty by education and migration. And this is beneficial to us. We're in desperate need of workers. We're a shrinking birth rate, we're an aging population, and we need people to help us in Europe. So if we can manage that, and it can be a win-win for everybody.
Jan?
I agree with Patricia. We have 260 million migrants in the world. We have 68.5 refugees, out of which 40 are inside countries, 28.5 outside. Both these trends will continue. I think we should accept that that is the trend. And the migrant side, you will see also, unfortunately, I would say the borderline between migrants and refugees this is not disappearing, but getting very fuzzy, because you have people already leaving desperate conditions, actually starvation and death, because of droughts. And soon we will have movements from the rising sea level. In fact, I saw it. I've seen it in Asia recently, in Myanmar, and even in the Mekong Delta, people are moving in. So we see that. But what I find most important is that we in the Western world, particularly Europe and the United States, start to at least have a more neutral narrative about refugees. Because out of these 28.5 million people refugees, 80% are in neighboring countries of crisis, in usually poor countries. And 20% have going marching through Mexico, United States, and coming from Syria and more and more from Africa to Europe. And if we let this be the primary political tool in the poison that I find coming into our societies and used as a powerful and successful tool, then we are in trouble.
Yeah.
And therefore we need to bring in the elements that and my own family, same thing, you know, they went to America because they wanted to get away from starvation in Sweden. And they were now building up the American great society and the melting pot syndrome.
Building the rails.
And at least have that on for what economic benefits and demographic benefits, and the fact that remittances are a more important official development system. That's narrative we have to change. Otherwise, this whole debate will be going off in a horrible direction on a phenomenon that definitely will grow with pluses and minuses.
Vladimir?
I have 3 points. Some of them were already mentioned. First, migration will continue, but it will be contained, restricted, and managed. In what ways we do not know, but this is a general trend. Secondly, there will be a big issue. There is already this issue. It will continue to be even bigger. It's about accommodating the migrants in the Western societies.
Yeah.
It's about assimilation or about integration or about something else, but this is a big cultural and civilizational problems. And the third issue is a bigger one. I agree that development aid is not a solution, but a bigger issue is about the relationship between center and periphery of the international system. And it concerns everything. It concerns culture, economy, finance, movement of people, but also information, technology, and everything. But this is a bigger issue. It goes beyond the problem of migration.
Right. Okay,
Can we say something optimistic?
Yeah, well...
No.
Who's moderating? All right, that was me. Yes, I remember now. So what I was going to say is that if you will indulge the panel for a few more minutes, I'm going to give a challenge, which is for 1 minute, right, to say something optimistic. Now, for some of you, this is a small challenge because you have optimistic thoughts all the time. And for 2 or 3 of you, it's really quite a big challenge. But we're just going to go along the panel.
1 minute.
1 minute each, not viciously timed, but nonetheless. So, some point of optimism.
Yes, very good. When the Cold War ended, there was a vision of the end of history in a positive sense. It was a positive vision, and we all know that it was not implemented. There was no end of history. The triumphalism of liberalism hasn't taken place. But I think that we can be optimistic if we are thinking about history. I have already said this. We knew worse periods in our history, and we know our history teaches us that it's possible to get out of the very serious critical situations, and this is a source of my optimism.
Yeah.
First hope, women, biggest hope.
Not enough of us.
The biggest hope.
Let him come.
And the board will next time reflect more of balance, gender balance. But that's a new and absolutely revolutionary factor that will change the world. So, and it must happen in the next 2 decades. Second, youth, young people. And we should not only work for young people, we need to work with young people. There's an enormous dimension into that, plus a vitalization of democracy if we succeed. Third factor, knowledge, education, technology. To get these goals, we need all these contributions from all sectors. And the fourth, I was about to say the last hope, but fourth, diplomacy and international cooperation.
He's taken all my lines.
Okay.
Welcome to the board.
I said them earlier, so you knew that. So I have faith in the next generation, but I have faith in humanity's inventiveness and our capability. If you look at the history of humanity, it's very much about being a very highly adaptive and inventing. And I think we will find ways to invent things to get us out of our messes. The big thing is to make sure that we don't enter into a mess which overwhelms us. And we've got a few of those on the horizon, but we see them coming. So we have the ability to predict ahead, not perfectly, but in some big trends. And this, of course, separates us out from some, perhaps, other species. So where we can do so much damage, we can do so much good. So let's take that and project ahead and reduce the worst of our excesses.
Yeah. Work with the strong sides.
Yeah, I think we can.
Sweden has lived 250 years in peace and given us SIPRI.
Beautiful.
Very good.
If the Swedes can make it, why can't we?
Wonderful. If they can do it in the cold, frozen north, then surely. Espen.
I agree on Sweden, by the way.
Yes.
Even as a Norwegian. But can I say something nice about United Kingdom? Because they have so much bad press. So I want to say one thing where they're really a star performer is that it's really the country in Europe that has reduced carbon emission the fastest. And they're now down at, believe it or not, 1896 levels.
Yes.
1896 levels, because they've had a war on coal through very high carbon pricing. They have invested heavily in wind power. And they're importing gas from Norway, which, although is fossil, is much better than coal, comparatively. So that transition has really worked because they wanted it to work. So these things can happen. And even in a country that is troubled by a lot of other issues, they managed to have a broad political agreement on reducing emission, and it can be done.
And we haven't Brexited yet.
Good. That's also. and just to complete my little discussion with our own ambassador, what I was saying is this is about burning oil, it's not producing oil, because for petrochemicals, gas can be turned into hydrogen with capture and storage. So it's not about not producing; it's about stopping burning things. I mean, it's about time. In the Stone Age, we started to burn things to keep warm, and in the Bronze Age, we started to melt things. And about time we learned to do something more advanced than burning everything we find. But there's still a lot of room in the circular economy from oil and gas.
Jean-Marie, last word.
Yes, well, I'm an optimist because I would like to be 20, because I think the next 50 years are going to be, actually, at the end of those 50 years, be much better than today. And I wouldn't want to be 20 if I was not an optimist. But the reason why I'm an optimist is because I think we live in a kind of renaissance. And at the Renaissance, there was a printing press which really challenged the whole idea of the legitimacy of power. It took 150 years of war to settle that, though that's the pessimistic part. But what we remember of the Renaissance is not the wars. It's all the new possibilities it opened. And I'm not saying that technology is going to solve our problems. I'm not a techno-optimist in that narrow sense. But I do think that a lot of the anxiety that we have heard in that debate comes from the fact that we, without being able to put our finger on it, we do understand that, we do sense that the framework of legitimacy, the states, the hierarchical structures, all that is under stress today. And we don't quite put our finger on what will be the replacement. And that creates a lot of anxiety. But I am an optimist because I do think that, as you said, human societies are resilient, and they are going to adjust to the enormous possibilities that are offered by this new technological revolution that we are witnessing.
Well, you couldn't see it, but behind your head, just as you were speaking, came up a little thing which actually summarizes what everything that everybody was saying, because it says that a program update is now available. And that's clearly what we need. It's time to stop this optimism, pessimism nonsense and get out there and reboot. Can we thank the panel for a wonderful conversation?
You became an optimist in the conversation.
Another applause for the great moderator.
Thank you very much.